Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Has Jordan. Allen shakes free. Gets two!
Gilmore on snap! Oh, brother. Lead Toledo Artists. You get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello, and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann, and joining me today is Chris Barnewell. He is a Hardwood Paroxysm contributor, and he's also editor for At the Hive, Charlotte Hornets blog. Chris, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
And we are going to talk about the top 50 greatest player case for Dwight Howard. He is 68th all-time in win shares, 42nd in win shares for 48, 71st in box score plus minus, 70th in value over replacement player. He has been named to 5 All-NBA first teams, 1 second team, 2 third teams. He is a 3-time defensive player of the year, 4 times an all-defensive first team, 1 time on the second team. He has 3 top 10 seasons of win shares for 48 and 3 top 10 seasons of value over replacement player. He is 5th all-time in effective field goal percentage. He is 4th in total rebound percentage, although I believe that only goes back to the 70s or so. So it doesn't include some of the historic players. On other top player rankings, he is 78th in the Bill Simmons pyramid ranking out of 96 players, and in the Slam 500, he is 86. These rankings were done in 2010, 2011, so they don't really account for the last few seasons, which for most players doesn't really matter, but for Dwight it actually might. So Chris, what do you think about the top 50 case for Dwight Howard?
It's definitely a difficult one to make because, especially with the last 3 years and the back injury, and because of his reputation just as a kind of an unlikable guy, it's really hard to get behind it because it's really easy to make a case for Shaq being like a top 50 player, besides the fact that he was as dominant as he was, because everyone liked Shaq as a player. Well, Dwight Howard he's kind of no one really likes him very much. So
yeah, well to be fair, Kobe didn't really like Shaq very much, but
Kobe was like the only one, I think. Dwight Howard might have not liked Shaq.
Yeah, Dwight didn't care much for Shaq. But I certainly get your point. I mean, I think there are some strengths in his case. He is one of the best defenders of his era, and he also had the challenge. There are going to be people who say, well, he didn't necessarily play in an era with a lot of great big men, but he has to defend more versatile big men, and he has to, go around the court and defend smaller players, and is expected to play in a more sophisticated era where he has to cover more ground on defense.
He's kind of in a weird era where he was a transition big man in a situation where we were going away from the whole Kendrick Perkins style of just be really big and really strong and get in their way, to you need to be mobile, fast, and be able to cover a lot of ground quickly. Yeah,
absolutely. And, he terrific pick and roll scorer. And, he also was the, important player, the most important player for a team that made the finals. He certainly has had success, not won championships, but has had playoff success. And
you can make the argument he should have been an MVP one year.
Right, yeah, he finished third, I believe, that year. And, yeah, he absolutely had a very strong case to be MVP. I do think that there certainly is a case. It is if he had been that same Orlando player the last 3 or 4 years, it would be a stronger case. But I think he still he was very good for quite a long time, and his career is obviously not over. He's only 29. I mean, he could possibly come back and still be have another few good years in him to add to his case. He's definitely obviously being a player who's still current, and he's one of the few players who we're considering who really can do a lot more for their legacy. But even at this point, I do think he's definitely worth considering.
Definitely. I mean, with him, you really have to look at the pre-back injury, or basically, I guess, pre-2011-2012 season, to really kind of get a good gauge on his career. Like, you have to look at the Orlando years, and then when you get to the back injury, you have to look at him again and say, well, how much do we consider the previous years when he was as good, and how much do we take away because of the back injury and toxic situation with the Lakers, and then moving with the new team in Houston? How much of that do you have to take into consideration and take away from his good years?
Yeah, and even even in the last few years, I mean, they've been bad by a certain standard, but
they've been bad by his standard. Which,
right.
If you go to like a normal standard, he's been perfectly fine.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And there are other players who have ridden. And other big men, frankly, who have ridden, in elite 6-7 years and then merely been good for a long time. I mean, honestly, Moses Malone has, really had 6 or 7 really, really strong seasons, and then was, pretty good to average for most of the rest of his career. And, I mean, if Dwight accomplishes that makes it interesting. Looking sort of at some of the deeper stats for him, if you kind of compare to his era position, so big men of his era, he is 7th in points per 36, 4th in rebounds per 36, 30th in blocks per 36, 1st in value over replacement player, 1st in defensive win shares, 2nd in win shares per 48. If you look at how he rates among his position all time, 35th in points per 36, 26th in rebounds per 36, 81st in block per 36, which is lower than I would have expected for Dwight in blocks, 15th in value of replacement player, 13th in defensive win shares, 11th in win shares per 48. So, certainly strong numbers, but I do think the thing for him that's going to be tough is he's obviously been a very effective player, but he is, he's at the position where it's not merely enough to be really good for a number of for a few seasons, to be elite for a few seasons. I mean, we're talking about guys like Russell, like Kareem, like Duncan, like Wilt, who dominated the league for a long time and
just forever.
Yeah, and
ever.
and have tremendous longevity too. We're dominant for more than a decade and lasted the league, Kareem's case, for 20 years. So,
and even look at like everyone's favorite comparison with him, which really in my opinion is a terrible one, is him and Shaq. And Shaq was good for probably a good decade and a half, while Dwight's reign is more of a 5-year really great level of play.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I sort of. I kind of think about where to sort of put him among the tiers of big men. I mean, is he like, is he in that second tier where, where I would put somebody like, David Robinson, Hakeem, Moses, Bob Pettit, Artis Gilmore, or is he in the third tier with, someone like, Ewing or Unseld or Willis Reed or Robert Parrish? Or Nate Thurman, like maybe sort of in between those guys. It's hard to kind of see where exactly he fits in. I guess it really depends on how much you value what he was able to do defensively. I mean, one thing about defensively is, those Orlando teams, he was not necessarily surrounded by the best defensive players.
Jameer Nelson, Courtney Lee, oh my goodness, who was the shooting guard? Someone named shooting guard that I can't remember at this moment. Rashard Lewis.
Yeah.
That was his Turkoglu.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Turkoglu. That was his 2009 team he took to the playoffs behind defensive 3-point shooting. Like,
yeah. And Courtney Lee's
that's
probably
insane.
Courtney Lee's probably the only plus defender out of those guys,
And he was a rookie, which means he didn't even know defense that well.
Sure.
Like, his defense is shockingly, it's really dumb to say this, but I feel like it's kind of true. It's almost an underrated part of his career because I don't think we had seen anyone that dominant during his time period as a player. Like the three straight Defensive Player of the Year awards, when was the last time that had happened before him? It was like Dikembe Mutombo or someone like that, right?
Yeah, Ben Wallace, I don't know if he had 3 in a row, but he won 4. But they were obviously split, among years, and Dikembe as well. But, those guys weren't asked to carry the burden on offense that Dwight was.
No, at all. And everyone's going to immediately go, well, he has no post game or he really can't score, which is a ridiculous assertion, by the way, because first, if we're going to go into the post game thing, you have to look at his career before Stan Van Gundy got there, when the big criticism against him was that he wasn't good enough on defense. He was this overpowering, gigantic big man down low that could score. He didn't score in a pretty way, by the way, but he scored. And he couldn't really do great on defense. Dan Van Gundy comes along, turns him into this elite defender, and still the same level of scorer. But everyone's all mad because he's not Shaq's overpoweringness or Hakeem's beautiful post moves. Like he looks very ugly on offense, but it worked. I want to say in 2010, which is arguably the Magic's best team they ever had under him, when he had let me look it up. It's got it right here. He had where is it? True shooting percentage. Sorry. He had a 63% true shooting percentage. 61% true shooting percentage with 22 points per game. That kind of efficiency just doesn't happen, even for big men. That is not something people are able to do. And it's really frustrating because everyone's like, well, his post game still isn't that good and he still can't score. Like, where you can't give him the ball and score. Yeah, you could. He doesn't score in the traditional way of back-eared man down for 4, 5, 10 seconds. Like, the only guys who do that anymore is Al Jefferson. He was really good at coming off the screen, grabbing the ball, 1, 2 quick moves, get it up. That was his bread and butter in Orlando as far as the post goes. And he was so good at that, and it's just crazy to say he's underrated in any way, but he was.
Yeah, and he's not doing that just on a few shots a game. I mean, he's taking 15, 16, 17, 18 shots a game, averaging that in during that time in Orlando. So he's a focal part of the offense. He's not just I agree that it is not necessarily he never really developed a refined offensive game for the most part. I mean, he does have some post moves. I mean, he can do some things. He had some touch and something. It wasn't pretty, but it was certainly effective. He could score. You could, get in the ball, and okay, you're not going to necessarily turn to Dwight Howard for the final shot, but how many big men in the league are historically have really been like the final shot of the game type guys? I mean, that
outside of the 90s when they had a defense that allowed you to do that, I mean, never.
Yeah, I mean, still you're going to Jordan, you're going to your guard a lot to create that final shot because because bigs don't create their own shots that much. I mean, they rely on passes from the they rely on passes from the guards. Obviously, you can they could create in certain ways, but it's still the last shot has traditionally been brought in by a guard or a forward. It's not usually the domain of a big man.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's for whatever reason that gets used as a criticism against him. And again, I feel like this goes back to the fact that he's not a very likable person.
Yeah.
And it's really silly because big men need the ball. Big men just don't dribble. They need the ball. Sorry, he wasn't Hakeem. There are very few players that are Hakeem. Hakeem's one of the greatest to ever play this game.
Sure. And even he, I would say, is a second tier on the second tier of NBA big men for me, which is just incredible because of just how many great ones there are.
Agreed.
So, my thought is that Dwight, there's a case there, but I do think that he's going to run to a numbers game where there's just too many great big men who had long careers of dominance, who were part of some of the greatest teams ever, and he's just not going to quite measure up to that standard unless he is able to have a second act in his career that's, incredible. In the last couple of seasons, last 3 seasons, he's, slowed down, dealt with injuries, been effective in spurts, looked like the old Dwight in spurts, but clearly seems like, that outcome doesn't seem super likely.
If he's ever going to get into that top 50 conversation, you're going to have to put him in that category of, well, look at the impact he had on the game, and you really can make the argument that him and Tom Thibodeau are the guys that created the modern NBA defense right now of get your big man down low, get your big man that can defend the rim, use him as your last line of defense and your first line of defense, and then get everyone back, have that guy stay and grab rebounds. Just they kind of helped with that modern defense. And you can look at what he did on offense and changed offense. Him and Stan Van Gundy basically changed offense for big men. Like pick and roll is now the best way to use your big man in the offense in today's NBA. And everyone's seeing Dwight Howard do that. Like his impact, he might go down as maybe a third-tier big man and not one of the greatest to ever play the game, like when you list him against guys like Wilt and Bill and Hakeem. But that's okay because he probably impacted it more than a lot of those guys did. Okay, maybe not more than the 3 I just mentioned, but a lot of guys that played.
I get what you're saying. Yes. That totally makes sense to me. Anything else you'd like to say about Dwight?
He gave me some of my favorite basketball memories as an Orlando Magic fan and some of my worst.
Any in particular that are your best?
The best has to be the game-winning dunk against the Spurs on the alley-oop play.
Oh, that's right. I remember that. That was great.
Had never seen that before.
Yeah.
Ever. And then, of course, the finals run in 2009. I still remember just being giddy over that. Yeah.
It's weird because, at one point he was actually pretty well liked. I mean, for his first 6 years or so, before he started really making it well known that he, wasn't interested in staying in Orlando, people didn't really have a problem with him. I mean, I guess he was always a goofball and he was always, a little bit of a weirdo, but that didn't really feed into his public persona that much. He was just kind of like a happy-go-lucky guy, and it was like, yeah, he seems fine.
Yeah, and then everyone kind of bought into it a little too much with, he can appreciate a good fart joke if he wants, but I mean, just no one needs to hear about it every single time, man.
Yeah. You gotta know when to hold him. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's appropriate there, but anyway, Chris, thank you so much for being on the show, sharing your thoughts and memories of Dwight Howard. Very much appreciate it. Is there anything you want to mention to our listeners about where they can find you or what you're up to?
They can find me mainly on Twitter with my Twitter feed at Chris Barnewell, at ChrisBarnewall. That's where you can mainly find me. And you can also find me on at the Hive and Hardwood Paroxysm, where I'm usually writing a lot. I have a post on at the Hive right now, actually, about Del Curry being the Hornets' first ever pick for the team and the expansion draft, and kind of how they coexist in the wave in their past. Like Del Curry and the Hornets kind of exist at the same time. It's really interesting. And then, of course, on Hardwood Paroxysm, I have a post right now about my sophomore crush, Aaron Gordon.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, everyone, for checking us out. And we'll keep doing shows looking at modern players and whether they are top 50 candidates. We appreciate any feedback on those or any other shows that we do. You can find us on Twitter at Over and Back NBA. We're also on Facebook at Over and Back NBA. And you can also, we have a new web forum that you could find at overandbacknba.com. And of course, you can find our podcast at hardwoodparoxysm.com. So thanks everyone for listening, and until next time.